Unmuted.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Business in the Community's webinar on the UAL. We're lucky enough to, some of us, be sitting in on a very gorgeous summer day, well, spring day, overlooking the canal here at Sheffield in North London. In a moment I'll be introducing our panellists, but first of all I'd just like to give you some context of why we've chosen to give a webinar about public reporting on employee wellness and engagement. When we started this campaign 3.5 years ago, we had numerous conversations with business leaders of why the whole agenda was important. And I think it's fair to say that every business leader knows instinctively that a happy, healthy and engaged workforce is going to be more productive. But certainly the norm has been that this agenda has been very much a bolt-on, kind of fluffy thing on the side to have. So in terms of actually elevating this agenda and positioning it as a strategic, holistic and integrated boardroom issue, is public reporting is a key objective of the campaign. Obviously the context of Cameron's Wellbeing Index and indeed Andrew Lansley's Public Health Responsibility Deal, which asks businesses to pledge to publicly report on health and well-being, has actually helped provide the context for moving this agenda on. But we've also been doing a huge amount of work with the investment community in terms of their opinion as to why this agenda is important, along with CIPD from a human capital management point of view. So we're going to say more about that shortly. So as I said, my name is Louise Aston. I'm the campaign director of BITC's Workwell campaign. And in terms of an overview of what we're going to cover this afternoon, in a moment I'm going to introduce our panel. Is basically from an investor perspective. My-Linh is going to be talking about why bother reporting, an investor perspective. We're going to tell you a bit more about our work on developing guidelines for public reporting on employee wellness and engagement. And then we've got some real-life case studies from Steven Boorman. And then at the end, you have an opportunity to have a dialogue with our panel. I'm afraid that we're keeping Q&As till the end, but we've got a decent amount of time, so you can either basically verbalise your questions or email them in. So this afternoon we've got a fantastic panel, which I'd like to welcome. Thank you very much. We're very, very lucky. Our first panellist is My-Linh Ngo. My-Linh is the Associate Director, SRI Research, Sustainable and Responsible Investment at Henderson Global, who have been our strategic partner on the whole investor's perspective. So can I introduce My-Linh?
Hello everyone.
Thanks, My-Linh. And our next panellist is Dr. Paul Litchfield. Paul is Chief Medical Officer at BT Group. BT are also a premier member of Business in the Community. And BT's work on this agenda has been exemplar. BT have been identified, at least through our research for the last 2 years with Mori, as an exemplar FTSE 100 reporting company on wellness and engagement. And Paul has been a real pioneer in terms of raising the profile on this whole agenda. So good afternoon, Paul.
Thanks, Louise. Good afternoon, everyone.
And our final panellist is Dr. Steven Boorman. Steve is Director of Health and Safety at Royal Mail Group. Steve is also a member of BITC's Workwell leadership team. Obviously, Royal Mail have had a bit of a rough time in the last few days, and actually we caught Steve eating chips on the corner. But anyway, I'd like to introduce Steve.
Good afternoon, everyone. Louise promised she wouldn't shock me for eating.
Anyway, welcome. So we'd like to start off with My-Linh, who's going to talk about why bother reporting an investor perspective. I'd just quickly like to say is Henderson very kindly hosted an event earlier this week with the investor community. We gave them a preview of our Ipsos Mori FTSE 100 research findings on FTSE 100 public reporting on wellness and engagement, which will be launching on the 10th of May. But there seems to be a real appetite here in terms of why this is of interest to the investment community.
Brilliant, thank you, Louise. Hello everyone, I've got about 15 minutes or so, and so the agenda I'd like to cover really is to give you a brief outline of who Henderson's is, what SRI investing is about, give you a sense for what the different strategies are that are out there for, when you hear the term SRI investing, and give you a sense in terms of what the size of the market is and what the trend in that is going forward. And then more specifically looking at the issue of sort of human capital management, reporting and sort of management of the issue generally. I'll just give you a sense in terms of why we as investors are interested in this issue, and look at how we go about trying to evaluate how companies are managing this, and then give you a few sort of, I guess, suggestions from my side in terms of over the years what we've learned in terms of what we would like to see companies report. And I guess what you'll see is I haven't spoken specifically on the issue of sort of health, safety and well-being, but been more broad looking at the issue of employee reporting, but I mean I think principles are broadly consistent. So moving on to the slide that I think you'll have in front of me, which is about Henderson and what SRI is. First of all is to say that I work for a fund management company, and that essentially means that we're investing money on behalf of our clients with the aim of generating superior investment returns for them. Well, we're quite a big player in the UK space of assets under management across a range of different funds, and just over 900 employees employed globally, although the majority of them are based here in London. Now, Henderson's is quite unusual in being one of the few fund management houses to have an in-house, what we call SRI team, or sustainable and responsible investment expertise. And on the slide there, I've given you a sense in terms of how much of the overall proportion of assets management we have within Henderson's are managed on an SRI basis. And we have this across a range of retail and institutional funds. Now, in terms of, I've already started to use the term SRI, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but if you see at the bottom of this graphic, I've also included some other terms that you might have come across that you might have been confused as to whether it's the same or different to SRI. So, for example, you might have heard the term ethical funds, climate change funds, socially responsible investment funds. It might all sound a bit confusing, but I guess what I'd say to you is don't get too caught up in terms of definitions and the phrases and concepts, but just remember most simplistically that they all basically, SRI is a collective term used to describe a set of investment strategies where environmental, social and governance issues are proactively considered in the investment process. And I think if you remember that, then you can't go wrong. So if we move on to the next slide, Tess. This here I tried to sort of give you a sense in terms of where the history, I guess, and the evolution of SRI over time, which has sort of influenced the sort of different strategies that are out there. Now, SRI in the UK very much started in the faith-based religious groups, and as a result of that, it was very much grounded in ethics. It was very much driven by what the investors' end value was. So this approach was very much characterized by maybe what people would term as negative screening, so areas of investments that clients wanted to avoid, and these typically excluded certain activities such as tobacco or military, or could have can include, how companies conduct their business. So, for example, excluding companies involved in employing child labour, for instance. Now, it started with that, but I think with the 80s and 90s, the agenda sort of broadened. People became more concerned about environmental issues such as acid rain and environmental pollution, and it became more one which was looking at how companies were being responsible and how they were managing issues. And in this sense, this approach at that time was very much, can be summed up by the phrase sort of investing in a best-in-class approach. So within certain sectors, investing in the companies that were the most progressive in terms of minimizing environmental impacts. And what we've seen in the slightly evolved again, and what's added to it now is what we call more of a focus in terms of positive screening. And this essentially means more thematic screening. So instead of avoiding certain activities, let's actually try to positively seek to invest in certain activities which are addressing specific environmental and social challenges. So here is that's where you started to hear the terms about climate change funds. So companies seeking to invest in renewable companies, energy efficiency, water management companies, that sort of thing. And I'd say maybe in the last year or so, again, we started to see another iteration of SRI where I've sort of put it on the slide here. Number 4 is integration. And I guess this is meant to sort of explain and sort of capture the fact that now a lot of mainstream funds are looking at ESG issues, not necessarily because they think it's there is a strong environmental, ethical imperative, but actually they think it could actually add value to the investment process. So they're looking to integrate it into what they do. So that sort of gives you a very sort of rough journey in terms of the evolution and different trends. So what you have is very much out there in the marketplace, although they may be called SRI funds, you have to be very careful and look underneath the label and see actually which of those 4 different strategies they employ. And it may be that they actually employ each of those 4 strategies to different degrees within the same fund. So that's really important when selecting a fund. Now, the second half of that slide is I've put on there was just to give you a sense in terms of how the market's grown, and this is data that was collected from these industry trade associations. So I've sort of got UK, which includes, which is part of Europe on there, and then the US. And I think you've seen from 1995 up to 2009, which is the most recent data available, is the sort of steady growth in SRI over time. And just to explain to you what, in terms of the drivers of that growth, that's been very much driven by consumer awareness as well as regulation, particularly on the institutional market space. And as I said, in terms of reflected in the latest iteration of SRI strategies, that a lot of investors are now starting to see that actually this might make investment sense and not just be a moral sustainability issue. Tess, if we can move on to the next slide. The next few ones sort of moving beyond the background of what SRI is to talk a bit more about why we as investors think ESG issues, and in particular sort of the area of employees and human capital management is important. As I said before, I mean, when we're looking to invest in companies, we make the distinction as to what is their products and services. So, you know, what products and offerings they have, and then look at how they do what they do, so their corporate responsibility practices. Now, that distinction is important because on the latter point, basically what we're looking to assess here is the nature and the quality of a company's relationships with its different stakeholders, whether these are external or internal. And the reason we think these are important is that if you think about it, a company isn't an island. It doesn't operate in isolation. It operates relative to its different stakeholders, whether they're internal like your employees or external like your customers or your supply chain. We think surely understanding the nature and the quality of those relationships is important because it has an impact on the overall performance of the company in the longer term, surely. And specifically looking at the issue of employees, we think they're really critical when you're looking at companies because they're the company's only internal assets, and also they're usually the way in which the company delivers its business sort of services. So they're the key interface with customers. So it's really, really key to understand how they're managing this resource effectively. So we do explicitly here at Henderson explicitly look at how companies manage their staff practices because we think it actually gives us insight into how a company manages other issues more generally and view it as a proxy for the overall quality of the management. And knowing this information, we think, will help us to differentiate between good investments and bad investments. Now, on the issue of employee reporting, and that is obviously the vehicle through which we can understand how companies are managing employee issues. Although we want to be looking at these issues, I guess what I'd say is that actually currently the quality of reporting isn't great out there for us to be able to do this in a systematic and robust way. Yes, we've seen over the years increasing sort of quality coming through and also increasing quantity in terms of more and more companies reporting on this issue. But I would say maybe on balance it's been more about quantity rather than quality. So the quality hasn't been there for us. And I think a key issue or dimension of quality is actually the lack of consistency in what companies are reporting externally, which makes it very difficult for people like ourselves who like to be able to benchmark and compare companies, who find that, you know, that's not possible because companies are reporting different metrics or they're not reporting in a systematic way. Moving on to the next slide, Tess. This here, I thought it might be useful to give you a sense in terms of, I've sort of said that we look at these sort of issues, but how do we actually do that in practice, and sort of give you a sense in terms of what the framework is. So if you look at the graphic on the sort of left-hand side, that sort of divides the assessment we make of companies into 4 clusters, and I think this is very similar, obviously, to the BITC model that they use. So we've got sort of business standards, we've got workplace, social, and which is community on that aspect, and environment. So obviously this issue of human capital reporting and sort of health and engagement fits into the workplace cluster very well. And when we're looking at how companies are managing this issue, we look at a sort of a range of what I'd call generic employee issues, as well as what we would say are sector-specific issues. So, for example, if you're a service company, maybe looking at physical health and safety is less paramount than looking at psychological aspects of health and safety, for instance. So we very much tailor our analysis to the nature of the company in terms of its products and services, its geographical region, its size. And when we're looking at a specific issue, for example, looking at health and safety, we try and take a very systematic approach. So, for example, we're looking at what the company reports in terms of what are its policies and systems, and then we balance that with, well, actually, what are they reporting in terms of how they've actually performed in that area. And that's another issue that sort of is linked to my quality comment before, in that we're finding companies are inconsistent in what they're reporting, and that some of them have a bias towards reporting on their policies and systems and give us very little sense of how they're doing on the performance side, which then makes it very difficult for us to judge how successful they have been in their efforts. And on the point about sort of performance reporting as well, is that in particular our analysis tries to pick out what we call leading indicators versus lagging indicators, and also tries to pick out sort of impact measures versus management measures. Again, here we're trying to sort of get a sense in terms of whether the company is performing well, and if it's not, on the leading lagging indicators, get a better sense in terms of, you know, where the trajectory is going, so that we can sort of pick up any early warning signs. So in order for us to be able to do any of this, public reporting by companies is absolutely key. So I mean, that's the reason why we've been sort of very active supporters of the BITC campaign, is that it's really key for us to be able to do that. And before I move on, and maybe just to explain the table that I've got there on the right-hand side very briefly, is that, as I mentioned, we look at the issues, specific issues, and how companies are managing it, looking at their policies and systems and their performance. And on balance, what we do is then we assign the company a grade based on how well we're managing that issue. And so that table just gives you an illustration of the spectrum of the gradings we give the companies, from the most progressive, which we call leading companies, to the most sort of what we would say is sort of lagging in terms of CR efforts, which we call resisting. So we may assess the company in terms of health and safety. We may say they actually have developing practices, so that means we think they're going beyond compliance in what they're doing. Or we may decide that they're actually classified as leading. That means that we think they're very, very progressive in this area, and they've been working on it for a long time and have really worked to integrate this within the business and understand the business impact. So moving on to the next slide, Tess. Next couple really just go into the what into a bit more in terms of looking at human capital reporting. So within this area, if we think it's important, what is it we're trying to find out? So the first set of bullets sort of give you a sense in terms of the questions that we're trying to answer. So for example, does the company ensure it recruits and retains the most skilled staff? And then how does it manage talent within the organisation to make sure that, you know, the company benefits from that sort of skill over the long term? And then the other issue, which this part of the initiative has expanded to include, and which we very much welcome, is the engagement sort of agenda. Is very much that this is the more softer side, but it's actually really critical as well. How does the company foster a culture where employees feel loyal and motivated and engaged to work and help the company succeed? In terms of how companies should be approaching this issue, we would very much, because we're investors, want you to make sure that you're not wasting resources or using them inefficiently and ineffectively. So we would like companies to be very business relevant in what they're doing. We think there is a case for companies being proactive in terms of not waiting for something bad to happen before addressing an issue. We think it's also really important as well, and I think it's particularly important here with the health and safety and well-being agenda, is that the companies need to take a holistic and multidisciplinary approach and not be siloed in terms of thinking about the issue, because everything is all interrelated. We think companies obviously as well need to be long-term. We're always cautious and advise companies against sort of short-term gimmicks that sound good, but actually in the long term will not make a lasting impact on the business. The last set of bullets basically just gives you a sense in terms of within the issue of employee sort of management sort of issues we look at, and as you can see on there, health, safety and well-being is one, and communications and engagement is another, and they're sort of two really key ones that we do look at. Moving on to my last slide test is sort of more generally, what advice would I give you in terms of as investors I'd like to see. First of all, is I'd really like companies to be publicly reporting on these issues, disclosing how they're managing it. So often we find that actually companies are not very good, and then when we later contact them, they actually have a lot more robust practices than would appear to be the case. Unfortunately, companies assume that you know what they're doing internally, but the reality is they don't, a lot of people don't know what's happening. So in the absence of information, they assume the worst. In terms of what companies should be reporting, again, another steer I would give is that they should be very, very clear in terms of what the audience is that they're targeting. The purpose of the reporting, is it external, internal purpose? Is it to update, or is it to sort of consult, that sort of thing? In terms of what is the scope of the reporting, is it only going to be on an environmental aspect or a social aspect? Is it going to be only the UK business or the whole business, that sort of thing? So it manages people's expectations. I would encourage companies to be regular in their reporting as well. We're not prescriptive about how often companies should report, although generally I think the agreed good practices on at least on an annual basis would be helpful. Going back to the point about quality I made earlier, it's really important for companies to be systematic in what they're reporting. As I said, to balance the reporting of their management practices with the performance reporting. They should be business focused. I have to get that back in because I'm an investor and it's really key for us. Comparable is a point that goes back to quality again that I made before, is the whole issue about companies reporting standardized metrics so that we as investors and other stakeholders can benchmark companies on how they're doing on these issues. I would also say as well that a lot of company reporting tends to be very reflective, but actually it should also be forward-looking in that although you may talk about what your performance has been in the last year, it's also useful for the reader to get a sense for actually where do you want to be going next year and what are going to be your sort of priorities in the near term. The next point basically comes down to, I guess, a point about corporate responsibility and human capital reporting not being a marketing sort of document, not being a marketing agenda. Otherwise, companies risk being charged of greenwash. Companies, I think, need to be frank and honest. They have to tell you, it would be good if they could tell you what was going well and what was not going well, what issues were proving particularly challenging, because I think having that sort of tone actually helps set the scene and sort of manages people's expectations about what they can achieve and what is possible. And often I talk to companies as well in terms of asking them, encouraging them actually proactively to raise what I call dilemma issues with the reader, to say, look, this is the issue within the company, this is what we've done to try and address it, this hasn't worked, we don't know why it's worked, it could be all these different areas. And actually by doing that, potentially, yes, you could open yourself up to criticism, but actually I think the other the consequences, actually, you may end up having a more constructive relationship with your external stakeholders, because maybe they can come back to you and suggest ideas about what the issue might be, and may work sort of result in more collaborative relationship and more of a long-term two-way relationship. And my last point there is just to say as well is that it would be great if reporting could be user-friendly. For us, it's not about quantity. So, I mean, there's a lot of reports out there that are quite a few hundred pages, and it's quite a challenge to read through them all. And actually, once you've finished, to get a good sense for, well, actually, what was that all about? And actually, where is the company strong? Where is it weak? User-friendly, then that's really helpful. And
I'm delighted to welcome Paul Litchfield from BT Group. And Paul, as I said at the beginning, exemplar reporting FTSE 100 companies who are providing thought leadership and direction for developing guidelines for public reporting on wellness and engagement. Is really the challenge for us is so many people have said, well, you know, what does reporting actually look like? And the reporting that's out there isn't always necessarily that useful for investors, as we've heard. So really our challenge has to actually align metrics against our evidence-based BITC Workwell model. And with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Paul.
Thanks very much, Louise. As Louise said, BITC asked me if I would chair the group working on this project. I'm not quite sure why they chose me, but perhaps I was the only one they could find to agree to it, because it's a bit like Challenge Annika, for those of us of an age to remember that, because this is not an easy thing to do. So the process that we have adopted has been to, first of all, look at what companies are currently reporting, and that's both the data that's published externally, as reported in the Ipsos Mori reports, but it's also looking at what companies collect internally and use themselves, not necessarily publishing externally. And so it's what they're reporting, but also why they're reporting it. We've then attempted to look at where's the commonality. So what are the measures and metrics that a number of organizations are using, because common sense dictates that if a number of organizations are doing it, then it's probably useful to them. And if it's useful to them internally, then perhaps it might be useful to external investors too. The Workwell model was the bit of work that attracted many of us to get engaged in this project, because it's an excellent way of showing what can be quite a complex issue, and many of us have found that model particularly engaging. And when I talk outside of the UK, it's something that works in multiple cultures. It would have been ideal if companies could have taken that model and then developed metrics to map onto it. In practice, of course, we need to reverse engineer. So what we've done is we've taken what is currently there and we've tried to match that onto the model itself. The other element that we thought was important, and My-Linh has spoken a bit about this, is not to just present things as black and white, but also to show that this is a journey for most organizations. And many of us start at one point and hope to move on to a more evolved, a higher state of evolution at some stage in the future. So we wanted to pitch the guidelines in terms of showing where people were on that journey. The next stage then is to socialize, validate what we've done, and to construct a matrix, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute or two. Thanks, Tess. The steering group, as Louise has said, is made up of 10 companies, all listed in the FTSE 100. You can see from the slide the names. Hopefully you will recognize all of them as companies that you're familiar with. The thing I like about it is not just that we're there, but also that it represents companies in a range of different sectors. So we have everything from mining through to retail, banking, service industries. It's a good range of businesses, and I think getting that group of people on board has allowed us to take really quite a broad view on what might be reported in the context of companies not just operating in the UK but also operating on in an international basis. Key support has come from My-Linh and her colleagues at Henderson's, but also from CIPD in bringing some rigour into the way that we're looking at the metrics, and of course the team here at Business in the Community have been driving the whole thing and keeping us on track, which at times I know has not been easy. Can move on. So in terms of the guidelines, which are now at a fairly advanced stage of production, what we put on the slide there are really the main chapter headings, so a bit of the background, what the model's all about, the principles that we've applied in terms of reporting. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. The template matrix, which is really at the heart of what we're producing, and then some case studies to put a bit of colour into it all and to allow people to understand how you might use these measures and metrics in the real world, and then finally flagging up some other resources that people might find useful. So in terms of the principles that we have adopted, you can see them on the slide there. They have been key in trying to define the measures that we are putting together, and that is still work in progress, and I'll share that with you in a second. But it's trying to get robust measures that match on to business objectives, to demonstrate that a strategic approach has been taken, to get the communication, the style of communication right, to look at companies that are taking a proactive approach to both the physical and, as importantly, perhaps even more importantly these days, the psychological elements of sustainable performance, and then ensuring that we're looking at the safety of our people, providing an environment that's secure for them to work in. The model you will all be familiar with, and what we have done there in terms of measures is to look at both inputs and outputs, as My-Linh was referring to, and wherever possible to try and match onto those inputs and outputs metrics that are meaningful, but also metrics which can be captured without too much extra effort on behalf of companies. If we make it too difficult for companies to collect data, then they're not going to do it. And if they don't collect the data, they can't then translate that into management information, which is going to be useful both in managing their own business, but also in terms of providing information for investors. As I've said, on the other side of that, we wanted to provide some view of where people were in the journey of evolution. My-Linh's 5 categories were ones that we looked at, and they're excellent, and I've seen them used in other contexts. In a way, they're a little bit judgmental, and so we were trying to get terminology that was less just judgmental, and so we've gone for entry, intermediate, and mature. Mature is good for those of you that is an advanced stage of life, as I am. So sometimes mature can be associated with going off a bit, but that's not the way that we intended it. What I'll show you now is really just 3 examples of where we've got to in terms of putting the matrix together. This is very much work in progress. It's moving very fast. Indeed, what's on the slide here is the version before the current one, because the current one has been written in the last couple of days since the slides were put together. But what we've tried to do is for each of the 4 quadrants in the Workwell model, we've tried to pull together both a description, which is in the model itself, but then the input measures, the output measures, and any metrics that can be used to map onto that. As I say, what's here on the slide is not what we're going to end up with, but what we are aiming to do is to get this model out there and get people comfortable with the structure, so that mapping onto the quadrant, the different measures and metrics, and then the different levels. If we can move on, please, Tess. So here's another one looking at specialist report, and again, the same format, but we've moved up a stage. So from entry level, we're now looking at the sorts of measures and metrics that one might see in a company that has gone somewhere along the journey, but not yet at the stage where we would class it as being mature. And then finally, the higher level of evolution. Now, of course, what one can only do with this type of matrix is show how things stand at the moment, and we see this as something that itself will evolve over time. So in time, what is considered mature today will become entry level, and that's the way that we get continuous improvement in everything that we do. So we recognize that this is a dynamic matrix, and as I say, the way that the different cells are populated will change over time, and are changing at the moment quite rapidly. So just to finish off, where are we at? We are coming towards the last stage of putting the guidelines together. We're looking at this stage to consult, and we're consulting widely, validating the concept of the matrix and the guidelines themselves. We will then be, over the next couple of weeks, looking at the measures in much more detail, revising those, and in particular adding some granularity to the metrics. So at the moment what we largely have are descriptions of what we might measure. What we're looking to do over the next couple of weeks is to show exactly what those metrics might look like. We'll then be road testing that matrix with member companies, seeing how it works for them, then finalising the guidelines so that we can hit our deadline of launching at the
Workwell Summit.
At the Workwell Summit, which Louise has ingrained on her mind as being the 10th of May. And then what we sincerely hope will lead on from that is companies will have the ability to benchmark their performance, and that in turn might well be of value to investors. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paul. I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Steve Boorman. Steve, as I said at the beginning, is a very valued member of our working with a large and complex corporate business. As I said, working from work done in the NHS, looking at linkages between organisational performance and outcomes and staff in terms of health, work and well-being, and of course in his role at Royal Mail in terms of making this a boardroom issue and having some really good impact measurements, were actually our Healthy Workplace Award winner a couple of years ago here at BITC.
Louise, thank you. I guess in the time remaining, it's my task to maybe show some practical examples of the types of things that My-Linh and Paul have already talked about. And I guess echoing Paul, really to show examples of a business that has been on the journey. And you might think examples from the public sector, from Royal Mail and from the NHS are really not of particular relevance to private FTSE companies. But actually I think public reporting and the requirement to actually show clearly the impact of what is being done by a business is increasingly a factor not just for the private sector, and is one of the areas where there's considerable overlap. Royal Mail is a business that is in a fiercely competitive marketplace at the moment, and issues of customer retention, issues of making sales in a very competitive environment, and showing that we're a quality and efficient business is really crucial to our business survival going forward. And I guess if we wind back about 10 years or so ago in Royal Mail, in common with many public sector businesses, Royal Mail had very little public reporting of any people measures. We were required to produce our annual reports and accounts. We reported on our financial measures, but probably our only people measures that we put into the public arena was how many people were actually working in the business, or at least how many people actually attended on a regular basis in the business. And it really wasn't seen as a particular issue, either externally or internally. I have to be honest that in terms of our reporting to our board saw relatively few people measures on a regular basis, tending only to see issues by exception when there was a problem or when they were requested. And also, if we looked at the quality of our ability to collect information about our people, we collected it in many different systems. We were often comparing apples with pears across the business, and it really was difficult to get any very accurate measures of how well we looked after the people that actually worked for us. But I guess when Royal Mail began to, in its last period of considerable business difficulty, we needed to be very clear in terms of how this issue contributed to our business performance and the business turnaround. And I'll be honest, we began our approach to improving our reporting very much as an internal issue, as part of being able to demonstrate to our board that investment in people was actually helping to deliver some of our business goals. Because our chief executive and chairman at the time were very clear that in order for our business to succeed and improve, we needed to do three very simple things. One was obviously deliver a profit at the end of the day. In order to deliver a profit, then the quality of the service that we were able to provide as a business needed to be better. And because we delivered our business through our people, then actually improving our business as a good place to work and showing the impact of our people on that quality and profit was very important to the business. So our journey began very much with an internal focus, where we wanted to be able to give clear and regular information to our board in terms of losses and impacts. We wanted to ensure that where we made investments in this area, we were able to document them and to measure the return on investment. And that we were able to evaluate the benefits in terms of anything cuddly, but actually in terms of reducing costs, improving productivity, and improving our ability to make sales as a business. But I guess My-Linh talked very much about the increasing value of, or increasing recognition of socially responsible investment. And over the years that I've been involved in this area, we've very much seen a tipping point. So since 2004, when we began to publicly report measures of staff health and well-being, we've increasingly seen this as becoming an important issue in tender requests in terms of our future customers wanting to understand our performance, and the measures that we've put in place internally to improve our understanding and measurement have enabled us to respond to those customer requests much more easily. We've also taken steps to make sure that we independently evaluate what we do. This is one example of such, where we actually commissioned work with the London School of Economics, not just to evaluate the simple financial return on investment that we'd secured through investment in health and well-being programs, but I guess slightly unusually to look at the impact on productivity. And you'll see in the third bullet of this slide that what we were actually able to show as we rolled out these programs across the business is that we were seeing increased productivity in terms of additional, in this case, parcels that we could deliver from a small depot, and 13 additional parcels a day for a small depot may not seem very much, but in a highly competitive market it really is actually the difference between making and securing sales and retaining customer satisfaction, as opposed to losing some of that business to our competitors. This is some data I've taken from the work that I was doing with the National Health Service, and one of the things that I found when I started the work with the National Health Service was that there was a dearth of information about the linkage between the health and well-being of staff and the actual ability of organisations to deliver their targets and goals. And we set out to do quite a complicated piece of work with the Work Foundation, with the NHS Information Centre, and with Aston University, where we looked at the performance of over 400 trusts across a range of financial measures, across a range of patient outcome measures, and in terms of their performance against the regulatory frameworks. This is quite a complicated slide, but it exemplifies data from 4 of the 400 or more trusts that we actually looked at. And what we found was there was a very significant correlation between trusts that did well in terms of the health and well-being of their staff, that are exemplified in green on this slide, compared with those that did less well, exemplified in red. We found that where there was good evidence of trusts reporting better staff health and well-being, there was lower absence, there was lower turnover, there was lower reliance on agency staff in the business. Importantly, measures of patient outcome were better in terms of patient satisfaction, infection rates, and even in some trusts, mortality rates. and consistently trusts that had better staff health and wellbeing measures actually performed better against their regulatory assessment measures. And it surprised me that this sort of data wasn't freely available, because I think it's an important measure for us to be able to understand performance. So very quickly in the next few slides, just some examples of how we actually manage reporting in Royal Mail. So this is lifted from this year's annual report, and you'll see that alongside our economic measures, in our workplace measures, we seek to ensure that we actually do report measures in terms of sickness absence and ill health retirements from the business. And then in the next slide we go on to actually explain those measures in terms of our performance, to use some real examples of how of our successes, but also as My-Linh said earlier on, our failures as well in some cases, but also to give a view in terms of what our priorities will be in forthcoming years. And I think that that's an important feature, mixing narrative reporting with metric reporting. And then finally, in the next slide, this is an example of an internal scorecard that we use with our board and executive teams. And I know that BT and many other large companies use very similar dashboard-type metric reporting to basically show patterns of key measures such as attendance, sickness, the patterns of the distribution of the types of sickness across the business, to compare the best and worst performing parts of the business. And the large box in the left-hand corner is used by our head of health to actually add a commentary pointing our executives to the initiatives that actually we've been undertaking, and to highlight any issues that we actually need our board or executive teams to actually focus upon. I guess, as Paul said earlier on, this is very much a journey, and it's a journey that we feel we've moved quite a long way on. In terms of moving forward, we would love to get to the position of some of the leading companies that are able to do this in a dynamic way and be able to show this not just on a quarterly or an annual basis, but to be able to report it in real time. And we're establishing within our business systems a way of actually being able to do that at the moment. I think that's enough from me, Louise.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Just like to thank all our speakers for excellent presentations. We've now got 10 minutes available for our delegates to ask questions from our fantastic panel. So please go ahead and either type in your question, or if you'd like to speak them, that's also fine.
Stunned silence.
I might have to pick on someone. Oh. No. Can I just urge again, if people would like to ask a question of any of our three panelists, or indeed I'm very happy to take more general questions about the campaign. Okay, well in that case My-Linh, I'd like to close the webinar with just some of your final thoughts in terms of this agenda and in your view what needs to happen next.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I was about to say, actually, I found that sort of last presentation particularly useful and particularly heartening, actually, to see that companies are doing this. And actually, interestingly enough, I would sort of back up what was said as well in terms of initially it may seem that a public sector example would seem strange to include, but actually it's really pivotal. And I think I've learned along the journey being involved in this process and talking to some of the other players is that actually the public sector, because of the sort of responsibilities and duties they've had in terms of reporting back to central government, they're actually a bit more further ahead of the sort of private sector in terms of reporting on these issues. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the public sector, and it's great to see as well the sort of attempts being made internally to link it through to sort of business impact, that sort of thing. And interestingly enough as well as maybe another comment I'd sort of make more broadly is that So often we speak to companies about internally what metrics on sort of health, well-being and engagement they consider important, and sometimes they're actually very different to what is actually reported externally. So that's interesting to see in this last part of the presentation, that sort of internal scorecard. And I guess for us what I'd say is, if the internal reporting metrics are different to the external, then why is that? And actually, if that's the case, I would, as an investor, be more interested potentially in the internal one than the external one, because obviously they've been decided internally that they're the more significant ones to focus on. So I think that's something for companies to think about when they're looking at reporting, is when I'm talking about considering the audience and what the purpose of it is not about ensuring communicating useful information and not wasting resources. But to reiterate, my last point is that we see the whole area of human capital management as being really key, and particularly the whole area of sort of well-being and engagement as being very important in terms of how companies are managing this issue and how this impacts on their long-term business performance. So I'd strongly encourage companies to really look at this area and look at improving reporting.
Okay. My-Linh, while we've got you, we've just received a question that is aimed to you. Basically the question is that guidelines, basically BITC guidelines, are going to be generic, and basically the question is, should they be sector specific? Is this something that investors would like to see?
I think yes, that's a very good question, and as I alluded to earlier in our assessment, we try and make sure as well in our analysis of companies we apply relevant issues. I guess what I'd say is that I think, as we found in our process as well, there are sort of core metrics that can be reported irrespective of what sector you're in and what size you are as a company. But within that, and within each of the 4 segments of the Workwell model, there may be specific aspects of that agenda which are more applicable to the nature of the business. And I guess what it comes down to, it's up to the companies to publicly communicate why they focus on certain areas and why they've decided to ignore others. And I guess actually the other wider point I would make is that actually that is a very good basis for starting conversation, in that you start talking to each other and sort of working out why we think that's the key issue, and if we disagree, at least we can have a discussion. So I think that's quite constructive to start off with. But I think it's very much for the companies. They know the business more, for them to come back to us and say, as investors,
research is Royal Mail's metrics look quite hard-headed. The ROI approach was quite unusual, and it's the Mori research. So I guess that's a kind of backhanded compliment, Steve, but in terms of commenting on that?
Well, I mean, I guess thank you if it is a compliment. I guess my board require me to be very clear in terms of what we're actually delivering, and I think that's not a bad thing. Just to pick up My-Linh's comment, we use our internal reporting to actually populate the external reporting, so there's no discongruence in terms of the data. And I think the Freedom of Information Act ensures that actually there's suitable opportunity to challenge that, and these are all discoverable documents. So.
Okay.
That's certainly true in the public sector, but not of course in the private sector. We also use the internal reporting to populate the external reporting, but what we tend to find is that there's much more detail in the internal reporting. And a lot of it gets edited out, so it's not that we wouldn't share it. It's a question of it gets squeezed out by other things. And if investors say it's of value to them, then it will appear. I think there has been a perception in the past that some of this stuff is pink and fluffy and therefore not of interest. And I think it's very positive that investors are saying they want to see it.
Okay, thank you. And another one for you, My-Linh. If there is one SRI metric, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. SRI of any? What, an environmental or social? Or? Oh, I couldn't give that.
I guess for this particular agenda.
Oh, this particular agenda?
Yeah, on human capital management.
I would say it's actually maybe a toss-up between a metric that would be very useful in terms of giving a sense about talent management within the organisation, because obviously for us as investors we're looking for companies to make sure they're able to attract the most skilled and knowledgeable staff so that they can sort of help the business succeed. So maybe a metric on how the company's performing on talent management. And actually I think the other area, which I think is slightly more challenging, is the engagement agenda, in terms of trying to get a sense in terms of how much more willing are employees willing to go above and beyond their normal job responsibility to really help the company sort of thrive, because they're totally sort of committed and loyal to them. And the reason why I say that's more of a challenge is that I sometimes find that the employee engagement metrics companies report are not necessarily engagement metrics as such. They're sort of measuring slightly something else.
I guess in the health arena we often make the mistake of focusing on the easily measured absence as being the measure. My problem with that is that that's very much a lag measure in the terms of what you were talking about earlier on, My-Linh. So I think very simply my company cares about my health and well-being, which is a measure of engagement. It's a measure of actually understanding.
Right, I'm going to take one last question, which I'll be intrigued to hear what each panellist what their opinion is, as we know, from the 15th of March is Andrew Lansley launched his public health responsibility deal, which I alluded to earlier, and one of the kind of key pledges that came out of it that was actually urging organisations to publicly report on employee health and well-being, and specifically talked about sickness absence reporting. And I mean, obviously there's a bit of speculation here, but it says, what will the responsibility deal commit companies to do? I'm not sure it's committing us to do anything, but I'd just like to hear Paul's point of view on that.
Well, we've been reporting sickness absence for as long as I can remember, certainly 10 years. So that's no great big ask for us. In terms of what it will do in future, I think it's more a question of big society. And I think actually what we'd be looking to do in the context of what we're doing with business in the community is report much more holistically than we have done in the past. So I think it's one of these things, it's a bit like regulation. You can move up the bar a bit, but actually the really good people were jumping well over the bar anyway.
Yeah. And My-Linh, just before I ask Steve, is what do you think of the government actually asking businesses to publicly report on health and well-being without actually giving any specifics, apart from asking for sick absence data?
Maybe it's an acknowledgement that they don't have all the answers, is why they've wanted to do that. I think obviously the signal it sends is very important, so it's more symbolic. I guess the challenge will be for them to follow that up with some sort of either a carrot or a stick to really sort of push it forward, otherwise it just becomes empty sentiment. But I think what I've noticed in sort of the work that we've been doing with you for the past 3 years is that we really see a coming together of different stakeholders on this agenda and recognising its importance. So I think, you know, more than ever, we've got that opportunity to succeed.
Excellent. Final comments from you, Steve?
Well, I mean, I guess I think it's important that the responsibility deal does include that commitment for companies, but as it currently stands, it's far too vague, and those that are good are already, as Paul says, well above that bar and already well committed and already doing it. And I think we need to be much clearer in terms of what the expectations should be.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we close the seminar, I'd like to thank our 3 excellent panellists, My-Linh, Paul and Steve, and I'd just like to end with a plug for our BITC Workwell Summit, where you can register or find out more at bitcworkwell.org.uk. You have an opportunity to hear Steve and Paul and My-Linh again at our amazing Workwell Summit, and we will be launching the Mori research along with the guidelines. So thank you all very much and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.